On January 4, 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt died with $105 million to his name, a sum roughly equal to everything held in the United States Treasury. He left nearly all of it to a single son. Within 5 years, one of his disinherited children would put a bullet through his own skull in a Fifth Avenue hotel room. But the Vanderbilts were not alone. Across 4 of the greatest dynasties of the Gilded Age, the same poison worked its way through the bloodline. The poison was not poverty. It was the inheritance itself. This is a story about money. More than that, it is a story about what money does to the people who did not earn it. 4 patriarchs, 4 fortunes, 4 wills carefully drafted to preserve a dynasty, and 4 families that tore themselves apart fighting over the wreckage. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Goulds, the Thaws. Each family built its empire by different means: railroads, real estate, speculation, coal and coke. But each family fell by the same force, not from outside enemies, not from market crashes alone, from the inside, from the children and grandchildren who turned the fortune into a weapon and aimed it at one another. A-Seat 1. The Fortunes and the Wills. Narik. Chapter 1. $100 million and one favored son. The richest man in America spent 50 years building a fortune and 5 pages destroying his family with it. Cornelius Vanderbilt started with almost nothing. Born in 1794 on Staten Island to a family of modest Dutch farmers, he borrowed $100 from his mother at the age of 16. That loan bought a small Perry auger, a flat-bottomed sailboat barely fit for the harbor. Young Cornelius ferried passengers and cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan, working 18-hour days in freezing spray for pennies a trip. Within a year, he had repaid his mother and turned a profit. The sailboat became a ferry business. The ferry business grew into a fleet. The fleet became a steamship empire that stretched from New York Harbor to Nicaragua, where Vanderbilt ran a transit route for gold rush passengers willing to pay a premium to reach California without crossing the entire continent. The steamship line became a railroad empire. By the time the Civil War ended, the man they called the Commodore controlled the New York Central Railroad, the Hudson River Railroad, and the Harlem Railroad. His railroads moved more freight and more passengers than any other system in the country. He was, by any reasonable measure, the wealthiest private citizen in the Western Hemisphere. The numbers alone told a staggering story. His railroad revenues exceeded $20 million per year. He owned over 10,000 acres of land. His personal income was larger than the annual budgets of most American states. When he walked down Lower Broadway, crowds stopped to watch. He was 82 years old and still working, still barking orders, still terrifying his subordinates. He was also a brutal and unforgiving father. The Commodore had 13 children. He buried several of them. The survivors learned early that affection in the Vanderbilt household was not given. It was earned. And the currency of earning was obedience. William Henry Vanderbilt, his eldest surviving son, spent decades trying to prove himself worthy. He was a quiet, heavy-set man, with none of his father's charisma and all of his father's stubbornness. The Commodore had once dismissed him as a fool, banishing him to a farm on Staten Island. William Henry worked the farm. He turned a profit. He waited. And when the Commodore finally needed a competent manager for his railroad operations, William Henry was ready. He had learned the only lesson his father respected: patience backed by results. The other children were not so fortunate. Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt, the Commodore's youngest surviving son, suffered from epilepsy at a time when the condition carried enormous stigma. His seizures were frequent and public. His debts were constant and humiliating. He gambled. He borrowed against the family name. He appeared in courtrooms and police blotters. The Commodore saw him not as a sick child, but as a failed investment. He cut Cornelius Jeremiah off repeatedly, relented occasionally, and ultimately decided that his youngest son would never be trusted with real money. The daughters fared little better. In the Commodore's world, women were ornamental, useful for marriages that consolidated social standing, not useful for managing capital. His daughters had married well enough by the standards of the era, securing husbands from respectable families. But the Commodore viewed their marriages as completed transactions. He had provided them with suitable partners. What more could they expect? When the time came to draft his will, the Commodore treated his daughters accordingly. The will itself was 5 pages long, 5 pages to distribute $105 million. In today's currency, that sum would exceed $2.5 billion. To grasp the scale of this fortune in its own era, consider that the entire federal budget of the United States in 1877 was approximately $270 million. The Commodore's estate represented nearly 40% of all federal spending, one man's personal wealth, stacked against the operating costs of an entire nation. The Commodore left $95 million to William Henry. He left the bulk of the remainder in trust for William Henry's 4 sons. To Cornelius Jeremiah, he left the income from $200,000 in government bonds. Not the bonds themselves, the income. At 5%, that meant $10,000 a year, a comfortable sum for a clerk, a deliberate insult for a Vanderbilt. To each of his 8 surviving daughters, he left between $250,000 and $500,000. Combined, the daughters received less than $4 million, less than 4% of the estate. The message was unmistakable. The Commodore had chosen his heir, and everyone else was an afterthought. The will was filed for probate on January 8, 1877, 4 days after the Commodore's death. Within weeks, 2 of his daughters and Cornelius Jeremiah retained lawyers. The largest inheritance battle in American history was about to begin. The question at the center of it was simple, and it would echo through every dynasty in this story. Can a family survive a father's final act of favoritism? The Vanderbilts were about to answer that question in the most public and devastating way imaginable. Chapter 2. Ghosts on the Witness Stand. The courtroom strategy to overturn the largest will in American history relied on one unlikely weapon, the testimony of dead people. The trial began in November of 1877, 10 months after the Commodore's death. The contestants, led by Cornelius Jeremiah and 2 of his sisters, needed to prove one of 2 things. Either the Commodore was not mentally competent when he signed the will, or he had been subjected to undue influence by William Henry. Proving incompetence against a man who had managed a railroad empire until his final months would be difficult. So the lawyers chose the second path. They would prove that William Henry had manipulated his father through the one weakness the old man possessed. The Commodore believed in ghosts. This was not as unusual as it sounds. Spiritualism in the 1870s was not a fringe movement. It was a cultural phenomenon that reached into the highest levels of American society. Millions of Americans attended seances. Prominent figures consulted mediums. Mary Todd Lincoln had famously attempted to contact her dead son, Willie, in the White House itself. The death toll of the Civil War, over 600,000 young men buried in unmarked graves across the South, had created an entire generation desperate to contact their lost sons and husbands. Talking to the dead was not madness. It was mainstream. But the Commodore took it further than most. Witness after witness took the stand to describe the old man's visits to Madame Morrow, a magnetic healer and spiritualist who operated out of a modest home in Lower Manhattan. The Commodore visited her regularly, sometimes several times a week. He consulted the spirits on business decisions. He asked the dead for guidance on his investments. He sat in darkened parlors while Madame Morrow laid hands on his aching body and whispered messages from the spirit world. And most critically for the trial, he believed he received messages from his deceased first wife, Sophia, who had died in 1868. The contestants' lawyers painted a portrait of a man in the grip of delusion. They argued that William Henry had exploited this weakness. The most explosive allegation was that William Henry had hired a medium to impersonate the voice of the dead Sophia, whispering from beyond the grave that the Commodore should leave everything to his eldest son. The ghost, in other words, had been a paid actress. The voice from beyond had been the voice of a woman in the next room, rehearsed and compensated, delivering lines written by the favored son himself. The courtroom was riveted. The newspapers were ecstatic. The New York press devoted entire front pages to the proceedings. For months, the most intimate details of the Vanderbilt family spilled across the headlines of every paper in the country. The Commodore's superstitions, his temper, his crude language, his relationships with women decades younger than himself. Every day brought a new revelation. Every witness added another layer of scandal to the family name. And there, in the shadows of the testimony, lurked the most dangerous secret of all. Victoria Woodhull and Tennessee Claflin were among the most notorious women in America. Woodhull had run for president in 1872. Claflin had operated a brokerage on Wall Street with the Commodore's backing. Both women had enjoyed a close and, by many accounts, intimate relationship with the elderly patriarch. If they took the stand, they could testify to the Commodore's state of mind, his habits, his susceptibility to influence. They could also reveal details about his personal life that would humiliate the family beyond repair. William Henry understood the threat. Before the trial began, he arranged for Woodhull and Claflin to leave the country. The price of their departure has been estimated at over $100,000, possibly much more. The exact figure was never confirmed because the transaction was designed to leave no trace. Both women sailed for England. Neither testified. This was the Vanderbilt way. When a problem could not be solved, it could be purchased. When a witness could not be discredited, she could be exported. The courtroom battle continued for months, generating over 9,000 pages of testimony and 3,000 exhibits. It was the longest and most expensive probate trial in American history to that date. But William Henry knew something the public did not. He knew the trial was theater. The real negotiation was happening behind closed doors, and the price of peace would be settled not by a jury, but by a checkbook. Chapter 3. The settlement that bought silence but not peace. William Henry Vanderbilt won the largest inheritance fight in American history, and the victory cost him everything except the money. The settlement came in March of 1879, nearly 2 years after the trial began. William Henry agreed to pay each of the contesting sisters an additional $500,000 on top of what the will provided. Cornelius Jeremiah received an additional $200,000 outright, plus a guarantee of $1,000 a month for life. The contestants dropped their challenge. The will stood. William Henry had paid roughly $1 million to end the war. Against a fortune of $95 million, this was pocket change. By any financial measure, he had won overwhelmingly. The fortune was his, the railroads were his. The Vanderbilt name, with all its weight and promise, was his to command. But money does not settle what money started. Cornelius Jeremiah took his settlement and continued the only life he knew. He gambled. He borrowed. He appeared in gambling houses along the Bowery and in the private rooms of establishments that catered to men of ruined reputation. His epilepsy worsened. His debts mounted faster than his income could service them. He applied repeatedly to William Henry for additional funds. William Henry, whose entire inheritance strategy depended on discipline and denial, refused. The brothers had never been close. The trial made them enemies. Cornelius Jeremiah had stood in open court and accused William Henry of fraud, manipulation, and elder abuse. William Henry had responded by treating his younger brother as a stranger with a familiar last name. The settlement bought silence. It did not buy reconciliation. On the evening of April 2, 1882, Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt checked into the Glenham Hotel on Fifth Avenue. He had spent the earlier part of the evening at a gambling house. He had lost. He wrote a short letter, and then he placed a pistol to his temple and pulled the trigger. He was 43 years old. His inheritance, the income from $200,000 that his father had grudgingly allowed him, had proven to be precisely enough money to sustain his self-destruction and not nearly enough to give his life meaning. William Henry received the news with characteristic composure. If he grieved, he did so privately. If he felt responsibility, he expressed it to no one who left a record. He was too busy doing what he did best, making money. In the 8 years between his father's death and his own, William Henry doubled the family fortune. $105 million became $200 million. He diversified out of railroads and into government bonds, real estate, and other investments. He expanded the family's presence on Fifth Avenue, building a triple mansion between 51st and 52nd Streets that cost $3 million to construct and contained rooms paneled in Japanese lacquer and ceilings painted by European masters. By the time he died on December 8, 1885, at the age of 64, William Henry Vanderbilt was the richest man who had ever lived in the United States. His death was sudden, a massive stroke during a conversation in his office. He fell from his chair and was gone within minutes. His will reflected everything he had learned from his father's mistakes. Where the Commodore had concentrated ruthlessly, William Henry distributed more broadly. He left the bulk of his fortune to his two eldest sons, Cornelius II and William Kissam, roughly $67 million each. But he also provided handsomely for his other children. No one was disinherited. No one was humiliated. The will was designed, with obvious care, to prevent a repetition of the war that had consumed the first half of his inheritance. It was the act of a man who had watched his brother die and decided that no amount of money was worth another body, and for a few brief years, it worked. The Vanderbilt fortune sat at its absolute peak, $200 million. The grandest houses in New York, a name that opened every door in America and most doors in Europe. But the seeds of the next war were already planted, not in the Vanderbilt family alone. Across Manhattan, along the same stretch of Fifth Avenue, 3 other dynasties were arming themselves for battles that would prove the Commodore's deepest instinct correct. You cannot protect a fortune by giving it away. You cannot protect it by holding it back. The money itself is the problem, and the heirs are the delivery system. The Astors were about to prove it with architecture. Aist 2, The Wars of Pride and Plunder. Chapter 4, The Battle for the Name, Mrs. Astor. 2 women claimed the same 3-word title, and the fight between them would reshape the skyline of Fifth Avenue. The Astor fortune was different from the Vanderbilt fortune in one critical respect. It was older. John Jacob Astor I, a German immigrant who arrived in America in 1784 with $25 and 7 flutes, had built his empire on fur trading, opium, and Manhattan real estate. By the time he died in 1848, he was worth $20 million and owned more of New York City than any other private citizen. His strategy was simple and nearly foolproof. Buy land, hold land. Wait for the city to grow around it. The island of Manhattan could not expand, but its population doubled every generation. The math was inevitable. By the 1880s, the Astor fortune had passed through 3 generations and grown to roughly $200 million. The family owned vast tracts of Midtown Manhattan, hundreds of tenement buildings, and some of the most valuable commercial property on Earth. Unlike the Vanderbilts, who had to manage railroads and negotiate with competitors, the Astors simply collected rent. The money was never in question. What was in question was something far more dangerous: the title. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the wife of William Backhouse Astor Jr., had accomplished something no amount of money could guarantee. She had made herself the undisputed queen of New York society. Her ballroom at 355th Avenue was the social center of the American elite. Her annual January ball was the most coveted invitation in the country. And her partnership with Ward McAllister, a Southern-born social arbiter with an instinct for exclusion, had produced the most powerful instrument of class warfare in American history: the list of the 400. The 400 was supposedly the number of people who could fit comfortably in Mrs. Astor's ballroom. In practice, it was the number of families McAllister deemed worthy of admission to the highest tier of New York society. To be on the list meant everything. To be excluded meant social death, regardless of how many millions you possessed. The Vanderbilts, notably, were excluded for years. Their money was too new, their origins too crude. The Commodore had been a ferryman. The Astors had been in America for a century. In the arithmetic of social prestige, time trumped capital. Caroline Astor enforced this hierarchy with ruthless precision. Her calling card system was an elaborate mechanism of social control. To leave a card at a home was to announce your existence. To have the card returned was to be acknowledged. To be invited to the ball was to be accepted. Every step was monitored, calibrated, and controlled by a woman who understood that power, real power, lay not in having money, but in deciding who else was allowed to matter. She called herself simply Mrs. Astor, not Caroline, not Mrs. William Astor, just Mrs. Astor, as if there could be only one. The problem was that there was another one. William Waldorf Astor was the son of John Jacob Astor III, Caroline's husband's older brother. By the strict rules of primogeniture, William Waldorf's wife should have held the title. His branch of the family was senior. His father had been the firstborn son. In the logic of European aristocracy, which these American families increasingly mimicked, William Waldorf's wife was the real Mrs. Astor. William Waldorf did not merely believe this. He insisted on it. And when Caroline refused to acknowledge his wife's claim, the conflict moved from drawing rooms to something far more permanent. William Waldorf owned the mansion at 355th Avenue, directly adjacent to Caroline's home. It had been his father's residence, and it stood as a monument to the senior branch's historical precedence. In 1890, William Waldorf made a decision that would echo across the history of New York real estate. He demolished the mansion, not to build a grander home, not to erect a monument. He tore down one of the finest private residences in New York City and announced plans to build a hotel in its place, a commercial hotel, directly next to his aunt's home. The message was unmistakable. If Caroline Astor would not cede the title, she would live next door to the noise, the traffic, and the constant stream of strangers that a major hotel would produce. Her ballroom, her kingdom, her carefully constructed world of exclusivity would be overshadowed by a 13-story temple of commerce bearing the Waldorf name. It was an act of social warfare disguised as a real estate investment. The building would become the Waldorf Hotel, and it would be, by design, the most luxurious hotel in America. Every dollar spent on marble and gilt was a dollar spent reminding Caroline that her nephew would rather destroy a family landmark than accept second place. William Waldorf did not stay to watch the construction. In 1891, he left America entirely, relocating to England. He reportedly told friends that America was no longer fit for a gentleman. What he meant, though he would never have said it so plainly, was that America was no longer fit for a gentleman who had lost a war with his aunt. The Waldorf Hotel opened in 1893, 13 stories, over 500 rooms. A palm garden, a Turkish bath, and the finest restaurant in New York. It stood there on Fifth Avenue like a siege tower pushed against the walls of Caroline's castle, and Caroline had to decide, retreat or fight back on the same terms. Chapter 5. Hotels as Weapons, Exile as Defeat. Caroline Astor considered building a stable next to her nephew's hotel, so his guests would choke on the smell of horse manure. The idea was not a joke. It was seriously discussed among her advisors as an appropriate response to what the family considered an act of open aggression. A stable, positioned deliberately to produce maximum unpleasantness for the Waldorf's guests, would have been a weapon perfectly calibrated to its target. Crude, effective, unforgettable. Caroline chose a different strategy. She chose to fight architecture with architecture. In 1895, Caroline Astor abandoned the home she had occupied for decades, the home that had served as the social capital of America, and moved uptown to a new mansion on 65th Street and Fifth Avenue. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, then demolished her old residence and announced plans to build an even larger hotel on the site. It would be called the Astoria. The mathematics of spite were elegant. William Waldorf had built a 13-story hotel next to his aunt's home. Now, Caroline's son was building a 17-story hotel next to William Waldorf's hotel. The Astoria would be taller, grander, and newer. It would loom over the Waldorf the way a parent looms over a defiant child. But the real genius lay in what happened next. George Bolt, the manager of the Waldorf, saw an opportunity where the family saw only war. He proposed merging the two hotels into a single operation. The combined Waldorf Astoria would be the largest and most magnificent hotel in the world. Over 1,000 rooms, 1,000 feet of corridor connecting the two buildings through an ornate passage that would become known as Peacock Alley, because its primary function was to serve as a promenade where the wealthy could display themselves to one another. Both sides agreed, but the contract contained a clause that revealed the true nature of the alliance. Either family could, at any time, seal off its half of the building from the other. The connecting corridors were designed with steel doors that could be bolted shut on a single day's notice. If the truce failed, if the families turned on each other again, they could sever the building in half and walk away. It was the most literal physical manifestation of a family feud in American history. A 1,000-room hotel with a divorce clause built into the foundation. The Waldorf Astoria opened in its combined form in 1897 and immediately became the most famous hotel in America. Royalty stayed there. Presidents dined there. It generated enormous profits for both branches of the family, and none of it resolved the underlying conflict. William Waldorf, in his English exile, grew increasingly eccentric and increasingly bitter. He renounced his American citizenship in 1999. He purchased Hever Castle in Kent, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, and spent a fortune restoring it. He bought a newspaper, the Pall Mall Gazette, and used it to promote himself. He courted British aristocratic approval with the same desperation his aunt had once used to guard the gates of New York society. In 1916, he bought himself a title. He became Baron Astor of Hever Castle. In 1917, he was elevated to Viscount. An American fortune, built on Manhattan tenements and the labor of immigrants, had purchased a seat in the British House of Lords. The man who once fought over whether his wife deserved to be called Mrs. Astor now insisted on being called My Lord. Meanwhile, back on Fifth Avenue, Caroline Astor was losing a different war, the one inside her own mind. By the early 1900s, her mental faculties were in visible decline. She continued to dress for her annual balls. She continued to receive guests in her uptown mansion. But the guests were imaginary. Her servants would find her in full evening dress, diamonds blazing, greeting empty rooms with the poise and grace that had once commanded the obedience of 400 real people. She spoke to phantoms. She introduced visitors who were not there. She presided over parties that existed only in the geography of her deteriorating mind. She died on October 30th, 1908. The woman who had invented modern American social hierarchy spent her final years in a private world where the hierarchy still held, where her ballroom was still full, and where the title Mrs. Astor still meant something. Her nephew outlived her by 11 years. He died in England in 1919, a viscount with no interest in returning to the country that had made him rich. He had won the title. He had lost the war. The Waldorf Astoria stood on Fifth Avenue as a monument to both their ambitions and the futility of the fight between them. The Astor feud proved something the Vanderbilt contest had only suggested. When the money itself is not in question, when both sides are rich beyond any need, the war does not stop. It simply migrates, from courtrooms to calling cards, from lawyers to architects, from bank accounts to ballrooms. The wealth does not calm the fight. It funds it. It extends it. It transforms a family disagreement into a generational siege, where the only possible outcome is mutual exhaustion. But the Astors and the Vanderbilts at least fought over tangible things: power, prestige, real estate. The Gould family was about to demonstrate what happens when the fortune is divided equally and the heirs compete to see who can destroy their share the fastest. Chapter 6. $10 million for a French count's champagne. Jay Gould divided his $80 million fortune equally among 6 children, and every single one of them found a way to turn equality into war. Jay Gould died on December 2, 1892, at the age of 56. He had been the most hated man in American finance. He had cornered the gold market in 1869, triggering the Black Friday panic. He had manipulated railroad stocks with a ruthlessness that made even his fellow robber barons uncomfortable. He had built an empire of telegraph lines, railroads, and elevated railways through a combination of brilliance, deception, and sheer nerve. He was also, by every available account, a devoted father. Unlike the Commodore, who wielded his will like a weapon, Gould designed his estate to prevent conflict. Each of his 6 children, George, Edwin, Howard, Helen, Anna, and Frank, received approximately equal shares. The total estate was valued at $77 million. Divided 6 ways, each child inherited roughly $13 million. In modern currency, each share would be worth well over $300 million. Gould had studied the Vanderbilt War. He had watched the courtroom spectacle, the newspaper humiliation, the suicide. He concluded that the Commodore's mistake was favoritism. If every child received the same amount, there would be nothing to fight over. He was wrong. Anna Gould was 23 years old when she inherited her fortune. She was plain, shy, and desperate for the one thing money could not directly purchase: social acceptance. The Gould name was toxic in polite society. Jay Gould had been barred from elite clubs during his lifetime. His children carried the stain of his reputation. No amount of money could erase the memory of Black Friday or the dozens of ruined investors who cursed the Gould name. Anna found her solution in Europe. In 1895, she married Count Boney de Castellan, a French aristocrat whose lineage stretched back centuries and whose bank account had been empty for nearly as long. Boney was charming, handsome, and utterly without scruple. He saw Anna's fortune the way a general sees an undefended city. He marched in and began spending. The numbers are staggering. Boney built the Pink Palace on the Avenue du Bois de Boulogne in Paris, a mansion modeled after the Grand Trianon at Versailles. He filled it with art, tapestries, and furniture that would have impressed the French court. He kept a stable of carriages. He employed over 40 servants. He threw parties for thousands of guests where the champagne flowed until dawn, and the bills arrived in Anna's accounts with the regularity of a pulse. He commissioned a 1,600-ton yacht. He bought racehorses. He decorated their apartment at the Palais Rose with gold leaf and Gobelins tapestries. He spent money not with the abandon of a man wasting someone else's fortune, but with the studied precision of a man who understood that every franc spent was a franc transferred from American industry to French aristocracy. In 11 years of marriage, Bonny de Castellane consumed approximately $10 million of Anna's inheritance. $10 million. More than many of the great fortunes of the era in their entirety, burned through on champagne, horses, houses, and the maintenance of an aristocratic lifestyle that existed primarily to impress other aristocrats. Anna finally divorced him in 1906. She immediately married his cousin, Prince Hélie de Ségan, a man who was only marginally less expensive. The Gould fortune had purchased 2 French titles and funded a decade of Parisian excess, and Anna had received in return a name that sounded better at dinner parties than Gould. But Anna's extravagance was almost modest compared to the damage her brothers were doing. George J. Gould, the eldest son, inherited not only his share of the fortune, but also his father's ambition. He took control of the family's railroad interests and immediately began expanding. Jay Gould's genius had been in buying undervalued properties and extracting profit from them through manipulation and leverage. George lacked the manipulation. He kept the leverage. He borrowed heavily against the family railroads to fund new acquisitions: the Western Pacific, the Western Maryland, the Denver, and Rio Grande. He dreamed of building a transcontinental railroad to rival the Southern Pacific and the Union Pacific. It was a dream that required his father's tactical brilliance and his father's tolerance for risk. George had the risk tolerance. He did not have the brilliance. Meanwhile, Howard Gould was waging his own private war against the family fortune. In 1898, he married Catherine Clemens, an actress of modest fame and enormous appetites. Howard built her Castle Gould on Long Island, a limestone palace that cost over $2 million and was never actually completed. He built a yacht, the Niagara, at a cost of over $500,000. He provided Catherine with an allowance that she found insufficient. When the marriage collapsed, Catherine demanded alimony of $36,000 per year, a record-setting sum that would be the equivalent of over $1 million annually in modern terms. She famously declared that it was hard to dress well on less than $40,000 a year. The divorce proceedings aired every detail of the Goulds' private life in the press, adding another chapter to the ongoing humiliation of the family name. Edwin, the quietest of the brothers, watched from the sidelines as his siblings consumed the fortune at an alarming rate. Frank, the youngest, pursued a relatively modest life by Gould standards, though his definition of modest still involved mansions and servants. Helen married a viscount and transferred her share to England, following the same transatlantic pattern as the Astors. Jay Gould's equal division had prevented the Vanderbilt scenario. There was no single favored heir to resent, no disinherited child to pity. Instead, there were 6 equal heirs, each pulling the fortune in a different direction, each spending as if their share existed in isolation from the whole. The family's business interests, particularly the railroads, required coordinated management. What they received was 6 different visions, 6 different levels of competence, and 6 different spouses, each with their own agenda. The panic of 1907 was approaching, and when it hit, George Gould's overextended railroad empire would be the first casualty. The family had turned equality itself into a weapon, using their equal shares to wage 6 simultaneous campaigns of destruction against a fortune that required unity to survive. The Gould implosion would be the loudest. But across town, a quieter and more disturbing collapse was already underway. A mother with $40 million was about to demonstrate that the most dangerous form of inheritance is not greed, not rivalry, not incompetence. It is love. Unconditional, unlimited, and backed by an unlimited checkbook. Act 3, The Collapses. Chapter 7. The Railroad King Who Lost His Father's Empire. George J. Gould inherited $15 million and his father's ambition, but not a trace of his father's genius. The distinction matters. Jay Gould had been a predator. He understood markets the way a wolf understands terrain. He knew when to strike, when to retreat, and when to let his competitors exhaust themselves before moving in. His son George understood none of this. George saw the railroads as an inheritance to be expanded, not a weapon to be wielded. He spent like a builder. His father had spent like a hunter. By 1905, George controlled or held major interests in the Missouri Pacific, the Texas and Pacific, the International and Great Northern, the Denver and Rio Grande Western, the Western Pacific, and the Western Maryland. On paper, this was an empire. In practice, it was a house built on borrowed money, and the foundation was cracking. The problem was leverage. George had financed his expansion not from the family fortune alone, but from bonds secured against the railroads themselves. When traffic was strong and revenue steady, the debt was manageable. But railroads in the early 20th century were not the guaranteed money machines they had been in the Commodore's era. Competition was fierce. Regulation was increasing. The Interstate Commerce Commission had begun to limit the kinds of rate manipulation that had made the first generation of railroad barons rich. Then came the panic of 1907. The financial crisis that swept through American markets in October of that year destroyed credit, froze lending, and sent stock prices plummeting. J.P. Morgan personally orchestrated the bailout of the banking system, locking the nation's financiers in his library until they agreed to pool their resources. George Gould was not invited. He was not considered important enough. The man who believed himself the heir to one of the great railroad fortunes of the era could not even get a seat at the table when the real powers of American finance gathered to save the economy. George's empire, built on leverage and optimism, had no reserves to absorb the shock. The Western Maryland Railroad went into receivership in 1908. The Western Pacific followed within months. The Denver and Rio Grande struggled under its debt load, unable to service the bonds George had issued to fund construction through some of the most expensive terrain in North America. The Missouri Pacific, the crown jewel of the Goulds system, began its long decline toward eventual bankruptcy. The numbers told a brutal story. George had invested over $40 million in railroad expansion during the preceding decade. The Western Pacific alone had cost over $50 million to construct, the vast majority financed through bonds. When the panic struck, the revenue needed to service these bonds simply vanished. Freight traffic dropped, passenger revenue declined. The entire financial model, which depended on growth that never arrived, collapsed under its own weight. George's siblings watched the collapse with fury. Their shares of the family fortune were tied to the same railroad properties George was destroying. Anna, who had already burned through $10 million on French aristocrats, now saw her remaining investments threatened by her brother's incompetence. Edwin, the careful one, had warned against the expansion for years. Howard, consumed by his own divorce, added his voice to the chorus of complaint. By 1912, the siblings had organized against George. They removed him from management of the family's shared properties. They filed suits. They demanded accountings. The equal division that was supposed to prevent conflict had instead created a committee of 6 owners with no chairman, no consensus, and no mechanism for preventing any one member from dragging the others into ruin. George retreated. He spent increasingly in the company of Guinevere Sinclair, a former actress who became his companion after his first wife, Edith Kingdon, died in 1921. What the family did not know, or chose not to acknowledge, was that George had fathered 3 children with Guinevere during his marriage. A secret second family, sustained by the same fortune his public family was fighting to protect. George J. Gould died on May 16, 1923, at the age of 59. He died in the south of France, far from the railroads that had made and unmade his family. His estate was valued at roughly $5 million. He had inherited $15 million. After 3 decades of expansion, management, and misadventure, he had managed to lose 2/3 of his inheritance, while simultaneously dragging down the value of his siblings' shares. The lawsuits continued after his death. His siblings sued his 10 children, the 7 from his marriage to Edith, and the 3 from his relationship with Guinevere, claiming George had squandered over $30 million of the collective Gould estate. The litigation would drag on for years. Jay Gould's careful equal division had produced not harmony, but a mathematical formula for blame. Everyone had the same stake. Everyone suffered the same losses, and everyone could point to someone else as the cause. The Gould fortune, $80 million at its peak, had been reduced to approximately $50 million, this during a period when the American economy had grown enormously, when sensible investments would have multiplied the original sum several times over. The Goulds had managed to lose money during one of the greatest periods of wealth creation in human history. But even the Gould collapse, with its divorces and debts and secret children, had a rational logic to it. Bad investments, expensive spouses, overextended leverage. These were comprehensible failures, foolish but understandable. What happened in the Thaw family operated by a different logic entirely. A logic driven not by greed or incompetence, but by something far more dangerous and far more human. A mother's love, armed with $40 million and aimed at the impossible task of saving a son who could not be saved. Chapter 8. A mother who would spend every dollar to free a killer. On the night of June 25, 1906, Harry Thaw walked up to the most famous architect in America and shot him through the face. The victim was Stanford White, designer of the Washington Square Arch, creator of the second Madison Square Garden, the Moorish Palace of Terracotta, an electric light that was the wonder of New York, partner at McKim, Mead, and White, the most prestigious architectural firm in the country. White was 52 years old, a towering figure in American culture, and a man whose appetites extended far beyond architecture. The killer was Harry Kendall Thaw, heir to a Pittsburgh coal and railroad fortune, son of William Thaw Sr., who had amassed $40 million in coke ovens and Pennsylvania railroads before his death in 1889, recipient of a monthly allowance of $8,000, which in modern terms would exceed $150,000 per month, a man who had been expelled from Harvard, a man who had been barred from private clubs for violent outbursts, a man whose family had spent years paying off the victims of his rages, his addictions, and his increasingly erratic behavior. Harry Thaw killed Stanford White because of Evelyn Nesbit. Nesbit was the most photographed woman in America. Her face had appeared on magazine covers, in advertisements, and in the studios of the finest artists of the era. She had been a model for Charles Dana Gibson. She had performed in the chorus of Florodora, the hit musical that launched more young women into wealthy marriages than any matchmaker in history. She was beautiful. She was poor. And she was 16 years old when Stanford White first noticed her. White seduced or assaulted Nesbit, depending on whose account you believe. What is undisputed is that White, a married man in his late 40s, had pursued a teenage girl from a poor family, plied her with champagne in his apartment above the old Madison Square Garden, and taken her to a room containing, among other things, a red velvet swing suspended from the ceiling. When Evelyn told Harry about her experience years later, during their courtship, Harry's obsession with White calcified into something permanent and lethal. Harry was already unstable. His family knew it. Pittsburgh society knew it. He had been expelled from 2 schools. He had thrown furniture through hotel windows. He had assaulted servants. He had, on at least one occasion, stripped a woman naked and beaten her with a dog whip. Each incident had been managed the same way. The Thaw family paid. They paid the victims. They paid the hotels. They paid the newspapers to suppress the stories. Harry's $8,000 monthly allowance funded not just his lifestyle, but the constant cleanup operation required to keep him out of prison. On the evening of June 25th, during a performance at the rooftop theater of Madison Square Garden, the building White himself had designed, Harry walked through the audience in an overcoat despite the summer heat. He approached White's table. He drew a pistol, and he fired 3 shots at point-blank range into Stanford White's face. White died before his body hit the floor. Harry stood calmly, held the pistol above his head so the barrel pointed toward the ceiling, and waited for the police. The room was filled with over 100 witnesses. There was no question of who had pulled the trigger. The only question was, what would happen next? What happened next would consume the Thaw fortune more thoroughly than any divorce, any bad investment, or any railroad collapse. Mary Copley Thaw, Harry's mother, was a woman of iron will and bottomless maternal devotion. She was also the controlling force behind the $40 million Thaw estate. When her son was arrested, she made a public declaration that would define the next decade of the family's history. She would spend every dollar of the fortune, if necessary, to save her son. She meant it. The legal defense assembled for Harry Thaw was the most expensive in American history to that date. The team included Delphine Delmas, one of the most prominent trial lawyers on the West Coast, along with a platoon of attorneys, investigators, and expert witnesses. The first trial began in January of 1907, and it became the most sensational courtroom spectacle since the Vanderbilt will contest. The defense strategy was, at its core, an invention. Delmas argued that Harry had been driven temporarily insane by the revelation of White's assault on Evelyn. He called it dementia Americana, the uniquely American madness of a husband driven to violence by the violation of his wife's honor. It was not a recognized medical or legal term. It was a phrase created specifically for this trial, designed to appeal to the jury's sense of masculine outrage. The first trial ended in a hung jury in April of 1907. 7 jurors voted for conviction of first-degree murder. 5 voted for acquittal. Mary Thaw had spent an estimated $400,000, and the result was a mistrial. She did not hesitate. She funded a second trial. The second trial, beginning in January of 1908, employed a different strategy. This time, the defense focused squarely on insanity. Expert after expert testified to Harry's history of instability, his childhood tantrums, his violent episodes, his expulsion from schools and clubs, the years of payoffs his family had made to silence the victims of his behavior. The defense argued that Harry was not temporarily insane on the night of the murder. He was permanently insane. He had always been insane. The family had always known. On February 1st, 1908, the jury returned its verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. Harry Thaw was committed to the Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane, a facility in upstate New York. Mary Thaw had saved her son from the electric chair. The cost, including legal fees, witness payments, and the various settlements required to keep damaging testimony from reaching the jury, was estimated at over $1 million. Harry's siblings, who had no say in how the family fortune was being deployed, watched as their mother converted their inheritance into legal fees with the single-minded focus of a general pouring resources into a losing war. The verdict was not the end. It was barely the beginning. Harry Thaw was alive. Harry Thaw was insane. And Harry Thaw had a mother who would never stop spending money to set him free. Chapter 9. The inheritance devoured from every direction. Harry Thaw escaped an asylum, fled to Canada, was dragged back, freed again, and then was arrested for whipping a 19-year-old boy. The saga of Harry Thaw after his commitment to Matawan reads like a parody of justice purchased by wealth. In August of 1913, Harry walked out of the asylum with the help of accomplices and drove to Canada. The escape triggered an international legal crisis. Canada arrested him. The United States demanded extradition. Mary Thaw funded legal teams in both countries simultaneously, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to prevent her son from being returned to Matawan. He was eventually brought back. He was retried in 1915. He was declared sane and released. The entire machinery of the American legal system had been bent, not broken, by the sustained application of Thaw money. Every hearing required lawyers. Every appeal required experts. Every transfer between jurisdictions required negotiations. The bills arrived at the Thaw estate like an endless tide. Then, in January of 1917, Harry was arrested in New York for kidnapping and assaulting Frederick Gump, a 19-year-old boy. Harry had lured the young man to a hotel room and beaten him with a whip. The arrest shattered whatever fiction remained about Harry's stability. He was committed again, this time to a private institution in Pennsylvania. More legal fees, more medical bills, more settlements to keep the victim silent. Harry's siblings could do nothing. The fortune was controlled by Mary. Mary's sole objective was Harry. The other Thaw children, who had committed no crimes and attracted no scandals, watched their inheritance flow out the door in a river of legal retainers and hush money. They could not stop their mother. They could not challenge her authority over the estate. The mechanism that was supposed to protect the family, a strong matriarch controlling the purse strings, had become the mechanism of its financial destruction. While the Thaws bled money through the courts, the other 3 dynasties were reaching their own terminal stages. Caroline Astor's death in 1908 had closed one chapter of the family's story. But the next chapter opened with catastrophe. On April 15, 1912, John Jacob Astor IV, Caroline's son, boarded the Titanic with his young second wife, Madeline. She was 18 years old. He was 47. The marriage had scandalized even the permissive standards of Gilded Age society. But Astor was rich enough that scandal was merely gossip, not consequence. When the ship struck the iceberg at 11:40 on the night of April 14th, Astor reportedly remained calm. He helped his pregnant wife into Lifeboat 4. He asked the officer in charge if he could accompany her, given her delicate condition. He was told no. Women and children first. Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, owner of the Astoria Hotel, master of a fortune exceeding $87 million, veteran of the Spanish-American War, inventor, real estate baron, and one of the richest men on earth, stepped back from the lifeboat and watched it lower into the darkness. His body was recovered a week later. His gold pocket watch had stopped at the moment of his death. In his pockets were $2,500 in cash and a gold ring. The fortune that could buy anything in New York could not buy a seat in a lifeboat. His death triggered its own inheritance battle. His will left the bulk of his estate in trust, with provisions for Madeleine that would expire if she remarried. The clause was specific and deliberate. The fortune would support his young wife only so long as she remained his widow. Madeleine remarried in 1916. The provisions expired. She received a settlement and surrendered her claim to the Astor Trust. The fortune continued its fragmentation, split among branches that no longer spoke to each other, and invested in properties that no single heir could manage effectively. William Waldorf Astor, the man who had demolished his mansion despite his aunt, died in England on October 18, 1919. He was a viscount. He was enormously wealthy. He was also profoundly isolated. His relationships with his own children were strained. His self-imposed exile had lasted nearly 30 years. He had won every battle against Caroline and lost the only war that mattered, the one against his own bitterness. The Gould fortune, meanwhile, continued its arithmetic of decline. 80 million at Jay's death, 50 million by the 1920s, and still falling. The siblings' lawsuits against George's children dragged through the courts. The railroads, mismanaged and over-leveraged, lost value year after year. The Western Pacific declared bankruptcy. The Denver and Rio Grande entered receivership. The Missouri Pacific limped along, a shadow of the empire Jay Gould had built with cunning and borrowed capital. 4 families, 4 fortunes, 4 carefully designed strategies for passing wealth to the next generation. And the identical result. The Commodore concentrated his fortune in one son and produced a will contest, a suicide, and a public humiliation. Jay Gould divided equally and produced 6 simultaneous wars of extravagance and incompetence. William Thaws placed restrictions on his unstable son and watched from the grave as his wife overrode every safeguard with a checkbook. The Astors built on the most stable asset in America, Manhattan real estate, and still managed to tear themselves apart over a 3-word title and a ballroom that held 400. No strategy worked. No plan survived contact with the heirs. The money, in every case, found the family's weakest point and blew it wide open. Act 4. What the Money Left Behind. Chapter 10. The Mansions That Became Museums and Convents. By 1973, 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered at a family reunion, and not a single one of them was a millionaire. Let that number settle. 120 people sharing a last name that had once been synonymous with the largest private fortune in the world. Not one of them wealthy enough to qualify for a designation that, by 1973, described a significant but hardly rare level of affluence. The fortune was gone, not reduced, gone. Distributed across so many heirs, consumed by so many mansions, diluted by so many marriages and divorces and bad investments, that one of the greatest concentrations of wealth in human history had simply evaporated in less than a century. The mathematics of the disappearance are worth pausing over. $200 million in 1885, if invested conservatively at 5%, would have grown to over $2 billion by 1973. If invested in the stock market, the figure would be higher still. The Vanderbilt descendants did not inherit $2 billion. They did not inherit 200 million. They did not, collectively, possess even 1 million. The family had not merely failed to grow the fortune, they had spent it faster than the richest economy in human history could replenish it. The mansions tell the story in stone and mortar. The Biltmore estate, George Washington Vanderbilt's 250-room French Renaissance chateau in Asheville, North Carolina, survives today as a tourist attraction. Visitors pay to walk through the rooms where the Vanderbilts once entertained European royalty. The house cost $6 million to build in the 1890s. It is now a business, generating revenue from ticket sales, a winery, and a hotel on the grounds. The family still owns it, technically, but ownership of a museum is not the same as ownership of a home. Georgian Court, George Gould's lavish estate in Lakewood, New Jersey, was sold to the Sisters of Mercy in 1924 and became Georgian Court College, later Georgian Court University. The palazzo where George had entertained railroad executives and society figures became classrooms and dormitories. The fountains where his children had played became landmarks on a campus walking tour. Lyndhurst, the Gothic Revival mansion on the Hudson River that Jay Gould had purchased in 1880 and filled with his art collection, was donated to the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 1961 by Anna Gould's daughter. The home where the most hated man in American finance had retreated from the world is now a public property, its rooms preserved exactly as they were, a monument to a fortune that exists only in the past tense. Hever Castle, the medieval stronghold that William Waldorf Astor had purchased and restored at enormous expense, became a tourist attraction in 1963. Visitors pay to see the gardens and the Tudor rooms, where an American exile had tried to purchase his way into English history. The castle that was supposed to establish the Astors as permanent fixtures of the British aristocracy is now a gift shop and a wedding venue. The Waldorf Astoria itself was demolished in 1929 to make way for the Empire State Building. The replacement Waldorf Astoria, built on Park Avenue, continued to operate as one of New York's premier hotels, but passed through multiple ownership changes, eventually being sold to a Chinese insurance company in 2014 for $1.95 billion. The building that had been born as a weapon in a family war became a commodity, traded between corporations with no connection to the families whose spite had created it. Castle Gould, on Long Island, Howard Gould's unfinished monument to his marriage with Catherine Clemens, passed through several owners and eventually became the Sands Point Preserve, a public park. The castle that was never completed while the Goulds were married was never completed after they divorced either. It stands as a literal unfinished sentence, a building that ran out of money before it ran out of ambition. Each property tells the same story. A patriarch built something magnificent, the heirs fought over it, and eventually the thing that was built outlasted the family that built it. The houses became museums, the castles became tourist sites, the hotels became corporate assets. The only things the money left behind were structures too expensive for any single heir to maintain and too beautiful for society to let fall into ruin. The fortunes built the mansions, the heirs lost the fortunes, and the public inherited what was left. Chapter 11. The Laws, the Scandals wrote. The spectacle of dynasties destroying themselves in public gave reformers exactly the ammunition they needed. For decades, progressive politicians had argued that concentrated wealth was dangerous to democracy. They had pointed to the power of the railroad barons, the influence of the real estate magnates, the way the Gilded Age elite controlled legislatures and courts and newspapers. But these arguments had been abstract, theoretical, easy for the wealthy to dismiss as the envy of the unsuccessful. The Vanderbilt will contest changed that. Here was the richest family in America, standing in a courtroom, accusing each other of hiring spiritualist frauds to manipulate an 82-year-old man. Here were mediums and mystics parading through the witness box. Here were payments of over $100,000 to silence inconvenient women. The public, reading these accounts over breakfast, did not see the triumph of American enterprise. They saw a circus funded by more money than most people would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. The Gould divorces confirmed the impression. Catherine Clemens. Gould's declaration that she could not dress properly on less than $40,000 a year landed in newspapers where the average reader earned less than $500 annually. The contrast was not merely unflattering, it was inflammatory. Anna Gould's transfer of $10 million to a French count who contributed nothing but a title and a talent for spending was equally provocative. American money, earned by American labor on American railroads, was flowing to European aristocrats whose sole product was their ancestry. The Thaw trials made the case undeniable. A wealthy young man had committed murder before 100 witnesses and been set free within a decade. His mother's fortune had funded an army of lawyers, alienists, and expert witnesses who had bent the legal system until it produced the desired result. The message to the American public was stark. Justice was for sale, and the price was denominated in Thaw dollars. The federal income tax, ratified as the 16th Amendment in 1913, drew much of its political support from the public anger generated by these very families. The argument was simple. If the wealthy were going to use their fortunes to fund social warfare, transatlantic extravagance, and the corruption of the justice system, then the government had both the right and the obligation to claim a share. The federal estate tax, enacted in 1916, struck even more directly at the heart of the dynastic model. Before 1916, a fortune could pass from father to son without any government intervention whatsoever. The Commodore's $105 million reached William Henry untouched. William Henry's $200 million reached his sons the same way. There was no mechanism, none at all, for the public to claim any portion of these transfers. The estate tax changed the fundamental mathematics of dynasty. A fortune that lost 10 or 20 or 40% with each generational transfer could not survive intact for more than 2 or 3 generations. The very concept of a permanent American aristocracy, built on accumulated and untaxed wealth, became mathematically impossible. The Thaw trial contributed its own legal legacy. The concept of dementia Americana, the temporary insanity defense rooted in masculine honor, did not survive as a formal legal doctrine, but it opened a broader conversation about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the degree to which wealth could purchase favorable outcomes in the justice system. Harry Thaw had committed murder in front of hundreds of witnesses. He had walked free within a decade. The mechanism of his freedom was money, applied systematically to lawyers, experts, judges, and institutions until the system produced the result his family was willing to pay for. The Gould divorce proceedings influenced the development of alimony law in New York and nationally. Catherine Clemens, Gould's demand for $36,000 per year, established a precedent for maintenance based not on need, but on the standard of living established during the marriage. If a wife had lived in a castle, she was entitled to continue living like someone who belonged in a castle, even after the marriage ended. This principle, refined and contested over the following century, became a cornerstone of modern divorce law. The combined effect of these legal changes was to make the Gilded Age model of dynastic wealth impossible to replicate. The income tax reduced accumulation. The estate tax reduced transfer. The evolution of divorce law ensured that every failed marriage extracted a significant toll, and the public spectacle of these particular families ensured that the political will to enforce these changes remained strong for generations. The dynasties did not merely destroy themselves. They destroyed the legal framework that had made dynasties possible. Their private wars became the public's justification for rewriting the rules of American wealth. Chapter 12. The curse that every fortune carries. Every patriarch in this story believed the same fantasy, that enough money could secure the future. The Commodore believed it when he concentrated 90% of his fortune in a single heir. He had built his empire through discipline, control, and the ruthless elimination of weakness. His will was the final expression of that philosophy. One strong son, one clear line of succession, one undivided fortune that would grow and compound and dominate for generations. Jay Gould believed it when he divided equally. He had watched the Vanderbilt War and concluded that the fault lay in favoritism. Remove the imbalance, he reasoned, and you remove the conflict. Give every child the same stake, and they will cooperate to protect the whole. William Thaw believed it when he placed restrictions on his unstable son. He knew Harry was dangerous. He limited Harry's direct access to the fortune. He trusted his wife to enforce the boundaries. He believed that the structure of the trust, the legal architecture of the estate, could contain the destructive impulses of a single heir. The Astors believed it when they built on Manhattan real estate. the most durable asset class in American history. Land does not depreciate. An island cannot expand. The rents come in whether the landlord is brilliant or foolish, stable or insane. The Astor fortune was designed to be as close to permanent as any private wealth could be. Every strategy failed. Every one. Concentration produced resentment, litigation, and suicide. Equality produced competition, waste, and mutual destruction. Restriction produced circumvention. The matriarch overrode the patriarch's safeguards with love and a checkbook. Durability produced complacency. The asset did not fail, but the family fought over status and prestige instead of money, proving that human conflict does not require financial scarcity. It only requires human beings. The pattern is not coincidence. It is structural. Inheritance does not merely pass wealth from one generation to the next. It passes the family's unresolved conflicts, amplified by millions of dollars and stripped of the one force that held those conflicts in check. The patriarch himself. The Commodore was terrifying. His children obeyed because the alternative was exile. When he died, the terror died with him, and the family members he had suppressed exploded into open warfare. Gould was brilliant. His children respected his judgment because his judgment had made them rich. When he died, the brilliance died with him, and 6 average heirs tried to manage an empire that required genius. William Thaws was cautious. His restrictions were sound, but restrictions require an enforcer, and Mary Thaws answered to a higher authority than her husband's will. She answered to her own heart. The great lie of inheritance is that money is neutral, that a fortune is simply a number, transferable like a deed or a title, landing in the next generation's hands unchanged and unopinionated. But money is not neutral. Money is power, and power, handed to people who did not build it, who do not understand its origins, who feel entitled to its benefits and none of its disciplines, becomes the most dangerous kind of weapon. A weapon with no safety and no owner's manual. The Vanderbilts went from the largest fortune in America to no millionaires in 4 generations. The Goulds went from 80 million to a fraction of that in 3 decades. The Thaws poured millions into the legal defense of a murderer and received nothing in return but headlines. The Astors built 2 hotels out of spite and then sailed into exile and imaginary ballrooms in the cold North Atlantic. 120 descendants at a reunion, not one of them a millionaire. That is not a failure of investment strategy. It is not a failure of estate planning. It is the natural, inevitable, almost gravitational consequence of handing enormous wealth to people whose only qualification for receiving it was their last name. The Commodore understood something at the end of his life, though he could not have articulated it and certainly would not have admitted it. He understood that his fortune was not a gift, it was a test, and he suspected correctly that most of his descendants would fail it. Every great fortune carries this curse. Not the curse of wealth itself, but the curse of the fantasy that wealth can be preserved beyond the hand that created it. The patriarchs built, the heirs fought, the lawyers profited, the public watched, and eventually the mansions became museums, the castles became tourist attractions, and the money, all that money, settled into the ground like rain. It left behind grand buildings and cautionary tales. It left behind laws designed to prevent any family from accumulating that kind of power again. It left behind a simple truth that the Commodore, for all his brilliance, never accepted. You can build a fortune. You can even protect it for a time. But you cannot control what it does to the people who come after you. The money will find the cracks. The inheritance will finish the job. That is not a warning. It is a history. And the history, across 4 families and 4 fortunes and 4 generations, is unanimous. The money always wins. The family always loses.